Welcome to Codex, a history of video games. My name's Tyler Osby.
And I'm Mike Coletta.
This week, we are still working on The Ultimate History of Video Games, Volume 2 by Stephen L. Kent. You should buy this book because it is really, really good. And we're on the tail end of Chapter 4 here, sort of where we left off.
Yeah, so there was actually a lot less of Chapter 4 than I thought. But to bring you up to speed, if you missed the episode or if you forgot where we were at, essentially Microsoft has just brought in Ed Fries. And this is important because, is it Fries or Fries? F-R-I-E-S.
If we're going off of like Mr. Freeze Batman rules, it's Freeze.
That's what I thought. That's what I always go off of, Mr. Freeze Batman rules in everything in life. So that makes sense. So Freeze is brought on board to add some legitimacy to Xbox because if you recall, last episode I talked about this, he is a gamer, like a gamer of gamers. He was designing Atari 2600 games as a kid. He also made Halo 2600, which is like a version of Halo that's on the Atari 2600. It's a homebrew video game, which is awesome.
It's exactly the same first-person shooter on... No, just kidding. It's not.
Yeah, right. But yeah, so Microsoft still had to prove themselves on the world stage now, though, and get the confidence of big third-party studios behind them. So EA, for example, when they were approached by this team to be like, can you make games for our new console? They said, specifically asked Bill Gates, like, we need to know someone's on the hook for this. Like, you need to personally fire someone and hold an employee accountable at Microsoft if this flops, which I found strange.
Yeah, that seems weird.
Yeah, but there's a quote from Kevin Bacchus that kind of explains it more. So here it is. This is on page 74. Quote, one of the things that Larry Probst at EA insisted on was, quote, who gets fired if this thing is a failure? If Nintendo isn't successful with their platform, they go out of business. But if Microsoft fails with Xbox, it's a rounding error. You'll just write it off and go on. It was really a priority among the game developers to see that this was somebody's sole focus, to see that Robbie couldn't just go back and pick up where he left off. End quote.
Gotcha.
So
that makes sense then, because they want to know that, like, hey, Microsoft, you guys are serious about this, right? You guys are for real, like, because if you fail, we know it's not a big deal for you, but if you fail, it's a big deal for us.
Yeah, exactly. So it wasn't entirely like, we want to see blood if this fails. It's like, we want to know, hold you
somebody
accountable.
is, because at Microsoft they could have just had like, this is like half of one person's job, right? Where it's like, or just a quarter of their job is to run the Xbox division. And so they need to know that it is somebody's sole responsibility and that they will be in trouble if it goes over.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
And in this case, that person was Robbie Bach. He was chosen to fill in those shoes. He was a tall corporate leader type, while Freeze was like the gamer. Bach was there to like please executives internally and externally because
he wore the suit and tie.
He wore the suit and tie. Business guy. Suit and tie business guy is a great way to describe Robbie Bach.
Suit. I was thinking like Bill Nye.
Suit
and tie, the business guy.
That's good. That's really good. We should start our own corporate PBS show about the business guy. Okay, so
suit and tie business guy. Copyright Codex.
That's right. Mark it right here, folks. Okay, so the third person in command of Xbox is Jay Allard. Just the letter J, Allard. It doesn't actually say what his first name is, but he was third in command as the vice president of the Xbox platform. And he was there as like the visionary type. But what's important to note is all three of these people, Ed Fries, Robbie Bach, Jay Allard, they were shippers. And shippers is a term that's used in the book for people that follow through, finish projects, and ship final products. So these are all people with experience completing a project and shipping a final product, which is huge because Xbox could have died in the development. You know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's important that this was here to like, these three were here to like make sure this gets done. So it's also important to note that Allard was the person that convinced Bill Gates, like in a memo he wrote, to push Windows kind of into the internet age. Like he was the rock star visionary. He saw the internet was a thing and that Windows 95 needed to have more internet elements to it. So, because it's the future. And he was kind of the rock star of the group. So on page 76, there is a quote from Pete Peterson, which is a great name.
Pete Peterson.
And it says, quote, everyone had a role to play. And Jay's role was to be the provocateur, the young, hip, cool guy, the voice and face of the gamer. He relished that role. He tried as hard as he could to make Xbox about as non-Microsoft as possible. It's almost like he used Xbox to flip the bird to the rest of the Microsoft organization. End quote. Which I just like because he really is like the cool guy. They also mention like he goes to like wild parties and stuff. He's like the opposite of what you think of when you think of like a nerdy Microsoft guy. He's definitely like going to metal band concerts and like probably doing illicit activities that we can't talk about on this podcast. Yeah, that's right.
Oh,
illicit
wow.
activities. Watch out, everyone. So Jay Allard was that person. It's also important to note that Freeze and Jay don't get along. Like Freeze and Jay don't get along, and it was Robbie Bach's job to like make them work well together. That's kind of a big thing about their relationship. So you might be asking now, like, okay, those are the three people in charge now that Xbox is like a thing that's being made at Microsoft. But what is happening with the original four? Remember the original four that had this idea to make the direct Xbox? Well,
Yeah.
three of them kind of faded into the project. Like they're working on the project, but they didn't really stand out as like someone. But we all know hero of Xbox, Seamus Blackley. He's not going to go quietly into the night and work on the console without talking about it. So he was kind of the perfect person to be the unofficial head of Xbox. He was courting the press, and he would say things like this amazing quote on page 77. It says, quote, he, as in Seamus Blackley, had a knack for offering good quotes. With his grasp of both science and games, Blackley often answered journalists' questions with equal parts solid information and bravado. When a reporter asked him the size of the Xbox's CPU, for instance, Blackley answered, quote, measuring a console's performance by processor bits is like trying to measure a car's horsepower by counting how many airbags it has. I thought that was nice. So he would say cool things like that, you know.
Nice.
To like so switch it up. So he was the person that was like the inside guy at Xbox, even though he wasn't technically like in a leadership position. That was not his thing.
To say that quote also, it was probably said because the Xbox is technically a 32-bit system, and that would have just sounded horrible in 2001.
Yeah. In fact, we're going to talk about the stats later on because there's a part that I want you to talk about because
Oh, cool.
I don't know stats in the early 2000s, but I bet you Tyler does. Okay. So things are not always like sunny and happy and showy for development in that first year, though. The team actually soon found that getting a console to run on Windows, which was the whole plan of the DirectX box, if you recall, was to make it run on Windows, right? You remember that, Tyler?
Mm-hmm.
Was not an easy feat at all. The memory it took to run Windows had a terrible effect on the rest of the console, and it caused some serious frame rate issues with gaming. Dang. So they needed to fix this. But with the deadline looming now, it's been a year, and they were supposed to announce at the CES show in January of 2000, but they skipped it. And then Gates wanted to now move it to GDC in March of 2000, but then they had to have the meeting. The meeting that is known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
Oh my gosh.
And it's called that because there's like 3 or 4 pages fully dedicated to this meeting. It's all quotes. You should buy the book. You should read this. Like, I'm just going to sum it up because it's the history part, but like, the meeting took place. It was the fate of the Xbox. It started at 4:00 p.m. on Valentine's Day 2000, and it ended at 8:00 p.m. 3 hours and 50 minutes of that was yelling, just yelling from Bill Gates and what's the other person's name that was in the group? Hold on. Say something fun, Tyler. Say something fun while I look this up. This is important.
I can just imagine being in a meeting that's just all yelling because it's just people who are they really need their voice to be heard, and that's the only way to do it. Some companies run like that where you just whoever's loudest wins the argument. And I think Microsoft, at least in this time, might have been one of those companies.
It's Steve Ballmer is the guy I was looking for. So
of course it was Steve Ballmer.
It was Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer going back and forth yelling at Bacchus and Freeze and Allard because they essentially told them, Bill Gates, he's like, we can't run Windows on this thing. It's not going to work.
But it needs to be on strategy.
And the workaround is going to cost lots of money. And it was essentially a screaming match for like, but it was a one-sided screaming match. It was Bill Gates yelling at the 3, and then Steve Ballmer would take over yelling at the 3, and then you go back and forth for 3 hours.
Gosh.
Like, almost 4 hours. And we know it's almost 4 hours because they get quiet about 3 hours and 50 minutes in. And I believe they don't know who actually said it. The reports are either Craig Mundy or Rick Belluzzo, who was also in that meeting, says, what about Sony? That's all it takes is the phrase, what about Sony, for Bill Gates to realize he has to do this because he needs to compete with Sony, because that was the whole point of this. Remember, like, Sony's coming in, they're now making video game consoles. Pretty soon they're going to have everything. They're going to have TVs. They're going to have everything. We have to do something. And then that ended the conversation with them actually getting not mad anymore, but like flipping a switch and being super excited about destroying Sony in video gaming. That Bill Gates essentially was like, have all the resources you need. Just do it. So It's kind of interesting because this meeting was like, we're about to get fired. And it went straight into, well, actually, we need to murder Sony, so we need to go in there and do this.
So so the argument was over how, like, whether or not they should use Windows, right?
The argument was, it was partially that, like, we can't have it run on Windows, which was the whole point of this thing.
Who was
like,
saying that? It was the people making the console. They were like, this sucks,
it was
we can't
the
do
team
it.
of Jay Allard, Ed Freeze, and then Robbie Bach. Them being like, we've tried so many different ways, and it's not running on Windows like we want it to.
And Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer were like, no, you have to make it run Windows or it's
exactly. Because the idea, remember, was that it would run Windows in the background, but the consumer would see something. We wouldn't see, like, you wouldn't see the XP desktop when you boot up your Xbox. We obviously know that, right? But it was like hidden in the background. And the whole point of this was so you could design games with DirectX to make it easier for developers to make great games on its console, because you're essentially just using PC architecture to design.
Yeah.
And they told them, like, it's not working and we need more time and it's going to be super expensive. Because last episode I talked about how the processors cost more than they thought, and they ended up like trying to make their own, which convinced NVIDIA to bring the price down. That price drop was still higher than they thought and they wanted. So they were telling the Bill Gates, like, one, we're not going to be able to play with Windows like we thought. We might have to do a modified thing. And two, we're going to be over budget. And three, we're not going to launch when we think. Like, it was a triple whammy, if you will.
So then Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer relented. They were like, you don't have to use Windows?
I guess they don't really say in the book at this time what they did. I think we're going to get to that later on in a different chapter about how they fix these problems, because obviously they fix these problems because we have an Xbox, you know?
Yeah, well, and it does run Windows, like how they say, like you use DirectX to make games on the original Xbox, and Windows runs sort of in the background, so they kind of got what they wanted.
Yeah, there's a workaround that they went through, I think, to tweak it and make it work. But it was like, at this time, they thought it wasn't going to happen. So then what happened after this St. Valentine's Day Massacre meeting? Bill Gates goes to GDC in March 2000 and announces the Xbox. And everyone is floored. Like, people thought it was happening. It was kind of like hinted at, but it was official. It was real. And I am going to read the tech specs that they have on page 82.
Mm-hmm.
Tyler, you can tell me if this is high powered for the time. Okay.
For March of 2000. Okay.
Yep. So the CPU was a custom Intel Pentium 3. It had an Microsoft NVIDIA GPU. It did run Windows 2000 kernel with DirectX. Kernel means it's a smaller version of it, right? Is that what that means?
No, all operating systems have what's called like the kernel, which is like the sort of smallest piece of it. I don't really know exactly, but it is like every operating system has the... If it's saying it's running the Windows kernel, that means down to a very small part of it, it is running Windows.
Gotcha. All right. It had 64 megabytes unified memory DDR, 64 voice, 13 DL2 audio process, an 8 gigabyte hard drive, 4x DVD drive with movie playback, which is pretty big because they had to complete with PlayStation, 4 game ports, 10 to 100 megabits per second built-in Ethernet, and a custom AV connector. So, like, I guess specs-wise, like, processing power-wise, was it good for the time?
It was pretty good. So March of 2000 would have been, it was Pentium 3 based. It was actually closer to the Celeron of those days, which was also Pentium 3 based, but I think it was a Coppermine core for all my hardware nerds out there. The Coppermine core was released in October of 1999. So that's a couple years late. It was like a low-end processor at the time when it was released, probably, this Celeron processor. So, I mean, all Celeron processors are kind of low-end. So it was pretty low-end. 64 megs of RAM, I think, was pretty standard for that time, though. Like, I wouldn't say it was a lot, but it also wasn't a little bit.
It wasn't nothing.
It wasn't nothing. An 8 gig hard drive was probably pretty small on the smaller end there. Probably, I think I want to say like 20 gig hard drives were becoming a little bit more standard around then. I could be wrong about that, though. Somebody should correct me if I am.
Didn't one of the Xbox 360 arcades come with a 16 gig?
The Xbox, so the 360 arcade came with no hard drive.
Oh.
And the one that you could buy for it was 20 gigs.
Yeah, it's still really small, even for the generation after this one.
It was
It's
pretty
still
small,
really
except for you weren't storing games on it on the 360. Because you weren't downloading games or installing them to the hard drive. That was not a feature or a thing at the time. So it was really just for media, for like storing ripped CD tracks, basically, and save games. So 20 gigs was actually pretty good. And when like arcade games started coming out to download, they weren't very big, so 20 gigs was not too bad either.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was like a sort of low end PC at the time. The graphics card is based on GeForce 3. It's like a kind of hybrid GeForce 3, GeForce 4, which was, I mean, depending on which one you got at the time, because there were high and low end of both the GeForce 3 and GeForce 4 graphics cards. I want to say it was on the lower end. But the operating system was very stripped down. It had one purpose. It didn't run anything else but the thing that you were running. So it ended up being pretty good for gaming, and was technically more powerful than the PlayStation 2 and the GameCube. So And the big thing about it was because, like you've been talking about, it ran Windows. You developed in DirectX, and it was a standard PC hardware. Anybody who made games for PCs or made software for Windows PCs, they could get started immediately using the full power of the Xbox. They didn't have to learn how to use all the special processors on the PS2 or all the cool weird stuff that the GameCube did. They knew it already. And that was a huge leg up, I think, especially when it came to getting PC ports of games like Half-Life 2 and Counter-Strike and all that stuff.
Yeah. By the way, so the end of this chapter, of chapter 4, Steven refers to this as Gates had fired a shot heard around the video gaming world. And it's kind of funny because he ends the chapter with just a bunch of quotes. And some of these quotes are from Nintendo executives being like, they don't know what they're doing. Like, sure, Bill Gates has money, but he doesn't know what he's doing. But the best is Sega, who's like super optimistic because they're just making software now, right? So Sega's quote, I love Sega's quote, is, quote, Microsoft has huge money, and I have heard that Bill Gates plans on spend $200 million on advertising for the Xbox. That is huge money. Sega has already committed to premiere 11 games on the Microsoft console.
Yeah. Well, Sega saw it as a money-making opportunity. They weren't going to talk crap, right?
Yeah, I love it. So, like, in Nintendo, everyone's like, no, this is like a terrible idea. They don't know gaming. It's a lot of like, Bill Gates knows computers, but he doesn't know gaming, you know? And it's interesting at the time to see the other people react and be like, no, it's crazy. It's a crazy thing to do.
All the software makers who are making games for the Xbox are like, yeah, it's going to be great. And they would have said that about every single console. They're not talking crap at all.
Yeah, Ken Kutaragi of Sony Computer Entertainment is pretty much saying Xbox got no games. It's kind of funny in his quote. So,
well, you know, I mean,
he's not wrong.
Wasn't wrong at the time.
Yeah, so that's the end of chapter 4, though. I think it's pretty cool to see like the early start of this, but we'll get more into it later on in different chapters. But let's move on to chapter 5.
Let's talk about chapter 5 here. So, starting off in chapter 5, like giving a little bit of background on Microsoft going into this generation. We've talked a lot about Microsoft already, but like these days, Microsoft is a very established and entrenched player in the console gaming space. They've had 4 generations of Xbox now. You know, they're sort of as synonymous with gaming as Sony or Nintendo are. But in those days, they were the newcomers still, like we were talking about. So it was kind of thought at the time that it was going to be impossible to beat Sony in this race, which is the name of this chapter. It's impossible to beat Sony in this race. The chapter opens talking about Bill Gates. He's big. He's a big name now, but in the late 90s, early 2000s, I think he was an even bigger name than he is now.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
At least in terms of like the popular culture, like he was part of the conversation more often. Nowadays, he's a billionaire who's doing philanthropy stuff. He's fighting malaria. He's doing all this great stuff. But in the 90s and 2000s, he was known as a ruthless business person. Like guy was sort of like the personification of evil to some people in how he ran his business and stuff. He was portrayed as like willing to just crush the competition any way he can, even if those methods aren't 100% legal. If this were like a general computer technology history podcast, we'd have to do a whole series of episodes on the Internet Explorer antitrust stuff that Microsoft had going on in the 90s. And their reputation was real bad during those days. At best, it was stuffy corporate businessman like reputation. At worst, it was everything that's wrong with capitalism. They're destroying their competition in non-ethical ways, in just taking their weight and throwing it around a lot, and really just crushing people. So they didn't have a great reputation. That's where we're going into when we get into the Xbox.
I didn't know about that. I need to look that up. About the Internet Explorer thing. I've never heard of it before.
It's so funny. It has parallels today, like with the Apple App Store and like the stuff that they're fighting out with Epic right now. It's similar today, and actually, like if they go based off precedent, I think it's pretty clear that Apple does have a similar. They have even more of a monopoly than Microsoft did. The idea was that Microsoft packaged Internet Explorer with Windows back in the 90s, as they still do. But back in those days, web browsers weren't necessarily free. They were like a boxed product you would buy at the store. And so them including their own web browser was sort of seen as this like anti-competitive, antitrust kind of thing where it's like, oh, you're using basically your monopoly on PC operating systems because you're either buying a PC or you're one of the like 4% buying a Mac. They're like, you're using your monopoly over PC operating systems to force everybody to use Internet Explorer, or to at least not necessarily force, but encourage it so much that other browsers just can't compete because they don't come installed on a PC, and you won't let them come installed on a PC. And I think they ended up losing that case. They had to pay a bunch of money. And then I guess the world forgot about it because browsers became free anyway, and it's easy to just download Chrome. But
yeah, well, I can tell you as a person who's now trying to get into web development, I don't like Internet Explorer. So
yeah, and everybody used it back in those days because nobody knew not to. Like it was synonymous with the internet. It was either that or buy Netscape from the store, So
yeah, crazy to think that you'd go to the store and buy a browser in a box. That's just such a weird idea to me. But you know what? Yeah, it makes total sense back then.
Yeah. Well, how else would you have gotten it? You weren't going to use a browser to download it.
That's right.
Yeah. So there was a different time, I guess. But yeah. And his if you can find videos of him giving his testimony and stuff to the court, or to like in depositions and stuff, he is like this really smug, you just hate him. You watch him and you can just tell he knows exactly what he's doing, and he's like, but I think it's legal, and so you can't stop me. And it's like, oh gosh.
Well, that probably makes sense why people think he's microchipping people now. If you watch this in the 90s or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like now he's like the sweet old grandpa billionaire who's giving away money. But in those days, he was not sweet old grandpa, and he was taking all the money. So
that's so
anyway, the point is, Bill Gates was a big deal. So when he said stuff, people listened. And he talked about the Xbox. He announced it at GDC, like you said, Game Developers Conference in March of 2000. And then again at CES in 2001, he unveiled the Xbox itself. And it was like chunky. It was like really, really large. It was twice the volume of a PS2. And so while it was bigger, Gates was also quick to point out the features it had that the PlayStation didn't, most notably the hard drive, and probably the Ethernet port too. And The Rock was there too, like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. And he was there in character. If you Google that video, it is a real piece of like early 2000s meme material. It's really good. But anyway, The Rock was probably huge at the time, right? I don't really follow professional wrestling.
Yeah, he was probably
I think he was
just
huge
wearing
at the time.
a black vest, if I had to guess. That was his wrestling outfit. It was just like a black vest and then like the weird Speedo things that they would wear.
He was in full character too, like talking about in sunglasses with the gold chain, I think. Yeah,
we're not a really wrestling centric podcast, but I even knew about The Rock at this time because if you're a kid in the early 2000s, you knew about The Rock.
You knew, yeah. Even if you didn't pay attention, you knew.
You at least would say to smell what he's cooking line. That's very important.
Yeah. So Microsoft was still the new kid in town. They had some stuff to learn. Like at E3 in 2001, when Nintendo and Sony held their press conferences a couple of days before the show, which is the usual. That's normally what happens. The Xbox team fell into a trap. They decided to host their show at 8 a.m. on Wednesday, May 16th. But what they did not account for was the party that Sony was going to throw the night before. It wasn't like an official party, but everybody knew it was the Sony party. And a whole bunch of people showed up there, and there was a lot of alcohol. And so when the journalists showed up at the Microsoft presentation in the morning at 8 a.m., they were all hungover and generally weren't all there, if you know what I mean. Was this intentional by Sony? Who knows? Do you think it was just a happy accident? What do you think, Mike? Do you think they did it on purpose?
Oh, it's strategy, 100%.
Yeah.
You gotta throw that party before the conference. Everyone knows that. And you give people free booze, they get all excited,
That's right.
It's the way the world works. Think about weddings.
Yeah. And the demo that they showed at E3 too did not go super well. They kind of had some trouble playing the games. They had some hardware troubles. They had to replace the Xbox on stage before continuing, which didn't help that their reputation, like Windows also had this reputation at the time of being this like thing that blue screened and was like generally unstable, but it was like this necessary evil that everybody used because you couldn't really use anything else. So the fact that the Xbox was also crashing and having a hard time was like, yep, sounds about right for a Microsoft product. Kind of reminds me of the Steve Jobs demo of the first iPhone in 2007. I don't know if you've watched that video ever or recently, but
I haven't.
It's really interesting because he shows off just everything about how the iPhone works because it was all brand new. Like this stuff was blowing people's minds. That is just a masterclass in introducing a paradigm shifting product to the world. Big fan of that particular demonstration, but it was very early in the iPhone's life. The software was not finished yet, and it was crashing all the time. And they had like dozens of iPhones ready to go to be like swapped out for every single demonstration they want to do because like it would crash, or it would be like, oh, if we want to go from showing text messages to showing photos, you can't do that. The software doesn't support it. It will crash. So it was like, okay, well, we'll bring out the photos iPhone, and then we'll bring out the text messaging iPhone, which is funny to me. And they do a really good job. You can't really tell they're doing it, but that's like the story behind the scenes there. So anyway, Microsoft had something similar going on with the Xbox where they had to like replace it on stage and stuff. So this is when Microsoft announced the release date, November 8th, and the price, $299. They also demonstrated the X Communicator, which was the microphone that would come with the Xbox Live Starter Pack a year later. It's kind of crazy to me how the Xbox launched with this Ethernet port and online capabilities that just weren't used for an entire year. They just straight up weren't used. No games went online. So that's why the first Halo game doesn't have Xbox Live support, which seems like a no-brainer today. Like, why wouldn't it go online? Because it literally couldn't. The Xbox Live didn't exist. But it did have System Link support. So I don't know if you could do this at the time, but you can certainly do it now, where you can sort of like Jimmy an online experience with System Link and a computer, and you can like sort of make it work online. You don't really have to anymore because there's like a lot of different ways to play Halo online these days. But back in the day, you could play Halo 1 online if you had this software that would let you do it, which was pretty cool.
I remember System Linking. So fun.
What?
System linking. Did you ever do that?
Oh, yeah.
Huge fan, 4-on-4. Oh, it feels so good.
So much fun.
It's like perfect.
Yeah. It was beautiful. System Link was beautiful. So Robbie Bach has this quote here about how Peter Moore, who worked at Sega at the time, went on stage to talk about how they make games for the Xbox, and it was the highlight of the show, apparently. So it didn't go super well. Like, the highlight of the show was that like Sega was going to make games, I guess, which is kind of funny to me. Yeah, not great. Not great. Not that Sega doesn't make good games or didn't at the time, but it was like, oh, that's what you got, huh? Everybody else is going to have Sega games too. Sega's not married to any one console anymore, so.
Yeah, your console should be the hype of the console show, not the publisher making games.
Yeah. So the console launched in November of 2001 in North America, but then it didn't come to Japan until February of 2002 and then March for Europe. Which was kind of puzzling to some journalists because they thought that like North American and European tastes, their like the preferences of gamers there would be more similar than North America and Japan, and so they were kind of puzzled why Europe got the last launch and Japan got the launch before Europe. I don't think the book ever explains why that happened, if there was any reason for it other than that's what they decided to do. I know that I, as a North American gamer, was pretty happy at the time that we were the priority for once because we were so used to consoles and games coming out in Japan months or years earlier and just having to sit around and wait for them over here from Sega and from Sony and from Nintendo, all these Japanese gaming companies that, of course, prioritize their own audience, which makes sense. But North America finally had its own hometown hero to prioritize its audience, so I like that.
Yeah, and if I recall, people in Japan, not big fans of the Xbox later on, they'd find out.
No, they were not. And Microsoft spent a lot of time trying to get them to be, too, and they really just, they didn't want to. And I'm sure, I bet Matt in Japan has a lot of like sociological reasons why Japan was just not really a fan of the Xbox, and so I look forward to an email.
Yes, once again, we're putting Matt on blast. Email us about culture in Japan.
He can. He can teach us about culture. So yeah, Microsoft promised that they had $2 billion dedicated to expanding the video game market, which is like, even for the established players like Nintendo and Sony, that was more money than they'd ever thought of ever being able to invest in their ecosystem. So Microsoft was new to games, but they were not new to business, and they had $2 billion that they could just throw away, and it was not a big deal. And this is why, like what you were saying earlier, when EA was sort of like well, we need to make sure that you guys are prioritizing this because you can throw away $2 billion and not care. EA at the time and probably still now, like, could not just throw away that much money. So
it's funny that EA is saying that now, and everyone knows them as like one of the money grubbing publishers.
Yeah, well,
you know,
yeah. Well, they were not as big then as they are now.
That's true. They didn't. Yeah, this was before like all their whole sports suite of like Madden and all that stuff. Yeah,
and there were a lot fewer ways for them to money grub. Like, I think the extent of their money grubbing in the early 2000s was like, we put out a sports game for every sport every year, and it was like that's pretty tame compared to the microtransaction fest those games are nowadays.
We should probably talk about it at some point, but it is like we haven't talked about the biggest game in the world because that's FIFA, right? Like, that's pretty close to being the biggest game in the world, I think, is FIFA soccer.
Yeah, I suppose big. It depends on how you define biggest, as in like
I would
most
say
globally relevant.
Farthest reaching in this case.
That's probably correct.
It's because like that's a game that is played all over the world.
Yeah,
and it's fair. Kind of we might need to. I might put that on the list because we need to give it its due diligence if it's played all over the world. And we've talked about before having like more world views of games because we definitely only really get the North American perspective.
Man, I love that you're bringing this up. I just watched a video recently by, I can't remember who it was by, but it was basically the question of the video was, do you know what the biggest game in the world is? And it was like, well, do you think it's this game? Do you think it's that game? Do you think it's Fortnite or Apex Legends or whatever? And it was like, well, if you think it's any of those, you're wrong. It's this game called Honor of Kings in China. It has 100 million players.
Oh my goodness, really?
It's the biggest game in the world by far. And have you ever heard of it?
No, I'm just completely wrong. I just assumed FIFA because like soccer is one of the most popular sport like worldwide. You know?
Well, that's why I ask. Like, it depends on what your definition of biggest game in the world is.
Honor
Because
of Kings, you said?
Honor of Kings, yeah. And I think the North American version of it is called Arena of Valor. I think those are more or less the same game. I could be wrong though.
This would
you can
be
play
a
it on
good-
Switch.
Okay, I'm having an idea here, and this is just us spitballing live on the podcast, you know, where we should try to get guests from different places in the world to just talk about the culture of gaming in their country. We've mentioned this before, but like Matt could help us out with Japan. But I would
at least
love
send
to
us
get
some
someone,
emails. We could at least read emails on the air too.
Yeah, because I would love to get like someone in China's perspective on gaming, because that's something I don't know anything about, and I want to know more about, especially now that you're telling me about this biggest game in the world that no one's ever heard of. You know,
it's
that
huge.
seems, and also like Europe, because I think we talked to someone from Brazil, so it would be good to just know about culture in different places in the world, because that's something that I'm very much interested in, and Tyler and I can't read and talk about it because I'd rather have someone living it, you know what I mean, to tell us about it. So
right. I think you're right though about FIFA being the most like globally resonant game. Like, people play it everywhere. I think like Honor of Kings is basically only played in China or Asia. Well, not only, like it's elsewhere, but like I think you're right about FIFA because soccer or football is like such a universal sport around the world, except in North America where apparently we don't care about it.
Yeah, I just was doing a show and I met someone after the show that they only play FIFA. Like, that's like their game.
Yeah,
and, I'm like,
and they'll buy it every year because it's not that big a deal to them to buy it every year.
Yeah, they spend $60 a year and they play this game all year. That's a great deal. Yep. Yeah, so it's like it's just interesting that I don't think, because you and I feel like are of the camp of like we gotta try as many games as possible, you know. Right. And it's like, no, there's some people that just play like, I mean, Call of Duty, one Call of Duty a year. I don't need to switch up. I get it. That's a great. You can do that. So anyway, sorry, we got off on a big tangent.
So
here we go.
Rewind time, 20 years ago, E3 2001. This was E3, and E3, like a really special E3 around the launch of new consoles. So Nintendo had to get up there, and they had to beat Microsoft by talking about both the Game Boy Advance and the GameCube. This was the E3 where they showed a face they'd never had present anything before. Satoru Iwata, R.I.P., rest in peace, big man. Mm-hmm. He would go on to become the president of Nintendo. He was like the big boss man. But at this point in time, he was on the board of directors, and he was the head of Nintendo planning worldwide. He'd been working at Nintendo for decades by this point, I want to say. But he was head of Nintendo planning worldwide, whatever. I don't know what that means, but it sounds very important. But unlike his counterparts who ran the company in the past, Iwata was a gamer and he was a developer. Like, he was not just he wrote code. Like, he is the guy responsible for cramming the entire Kanto region into Pokemon Gold and Silver. He did that, like, himself. He did that.
That's so cool.
which is awesome that he then eventually went on to run the company. So he was just like a monster at creating video games, which is awesome. So this is where Nintendo chose to double down on its commitment to being a games-focused entertainment company, not a technology company, specifically not a technology company. And I think they were sort of throwing a dig at Sony and Microsoft by saying, hey, we're not a technology company, we're a game company, and we make entertainment based around games, while these other companies are trying to wow you with specs and with DVD players and with whatever else.
Polygons.
Right? Yeah, polygons. I wonder if this was sort of meant to foreshadow that this was kind of going to be the last generation that Nintendo would compete on specs. Like after the GameCube era, Nintendo would always have the technically weaker console, and like they weren't trying to hide it. Like everybody knows that the Wii was way weaker than the 360 and the PS3, and everybody knows the Switch is not as powerful as a PlayStation 4 or 5. Like, but we're all cool with it because they deliver experiences that are different than what you can get elsewhere, be it in games or in a case of the Switch. Like that's just a different paradigm, right? It's a portable console, which is very cool.
The Nintendo Switch has made it so when I go on a flight, I boot up when we're taking off, and I don't turn it off until we're landing, and I don't even think anything of it. Like the time flies by. It's pretty great.
Yeah, and you're playing your whole console games there. Like
I'm playing Skyward Sword for 2 hours on a flight. I did it to Arizona. It was great.
That's awesome. Yeah. So we've talked about Nintendo and Microsoft at E3 in 2001. They both had some great hardware to launch. That was pretty exciting, regardless of how well the presentations themselves went. But Sony also had an E3 presentation to give, and because they had already released their hardware a year before the competition, they were able to just focus on games here and not talk about their hardware. They were like, here are the games, right? Because as we all know, you gotta have games. Otherwise,
everyone needs games.
Everyone needs games. So they showed a lot of games. They showed games like SSX Tricky, Final Fantasy X, Devil May Cry, which was a kind of I think it started as a Resident Evil game and then it turned into a spin-off of Resident Evil. I don't think it actually is related to Resident Evil at all, but it has the same creator now, or then and now, I suppose. But anyway, it sort of started as like a Resident Evil thing.
I've heard Devil May Cry games are just like really over the top and fun, in a fun way.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, they're just super, super gory and violent and like really just ridiculously stylized. It's a lot of fun.
I'm here for it.
Yeah, love it. This was the E3 when Sony showed off Metal Gear Solid 2. And I think we talked about this before in our favorite E3 moments, so you can go back to that episode to listen to like a more detailed breakdown of what happened here. But basically, it was this like really big bamboozle that showed players this awesome trailer of Solid Snake returning for another adventure on the PS2 with all these great graphics, and the gameplay was awesome. And they didn't show the main character of that game, Raiden. And when players finally got their hands on the game, they played like 2 hours of Solid Snake gameplay in the tanker chapter, and then the rest of the game, like probably 15 more hours, was some other character who isn't even on the back of the box. Like they really did the bamboozle here.
Yeah, you talked about this in the Metal Gear Solid episodes.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Gosh, I love that so much. That's classic Hideo Kojima, but I can understand why people would be upset with it because they thought they were buying another Solid Snake game and they did not get that. Anyway, that Metal Gear Solid trailer made a huge splash at E3 in 2001, and many saw it as possible Game of the Year material. They also showed off Gran Turismo 3, the first Jak and Daxter game, which remains a favorite franchise of mine to this day. Gosh, I love especially the first game. Just so much fun. I wish they'd bring...
Just more and more reasons I need to go join PlayStation this generation. There's just so many games I haven't played.
Yeah, well, Jak and Daxter, you can play it on your PC and an emulator and stuff.
Those are PC? I gotta find a legal copy of it.
Yeah, of course.
Go play it. Yeah, classic.
Yes, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
I wish that they would bring back that franchise the way that Insomniac has like kept going with Ratchet and Clank. They sort of gave up on Jak and Daxter after the third one. They had the racing game one, and then they had some other company made like a fourth Jak and Daxter game that was not very good.
See, this list that you're saying is bangers. I had Gran Turismo 3. That Gran Turismo 3 is a great.
That was a sweet game.
I love that game. Also, a little off topic, but you're mentioning games from your childhood. It sounds like Jak and Daxter.
Mm-hmm.
I found in my stack of N64 games I got from that friend, Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie. I have both of them for 64, and I think I might start playing those at some point, like over the holidays maybe. And I'm like, I can share this with Tyler. We can talk about it. Oh,
yeah.
So great.
Gosh, those games are great. They are better on the Xbox re-release, though. Playing them on Xbox Arcade.
I think I have them that way, too. I might just play the re-releases and be like, look, I have 64 versions, and then not play them.
Yeah, that's the way to do it. But the originals are great games.
I don't have a retro Tink either, so I can't play it on a flat screen. So,
well, yeah, you may have to do that then. Play it on your PC or play it on your Xbox, I guess.
Yeah.
But there was one thing that was missing from Nintendo's lineup of games this year at E3 for their launch lineup for GameCube, and that was a Mario game. Every Nintendo console had launched with a Mario game, and the closest thing the GameCube had was Luigi's Mansion, which was a game about how Mario was not there. He was missing. So maybe that's some meta commentary. I don't know. But they did still have a decent lineup. They had Madden, Crazy Taxi, and Tony Hawk 3. Like, let's be real. If you had Tony Hawk 3, you're good. Like, that's all you needed.
That's a great game.
Yeah, really great game.
The cruise ship level, I think, is in Tony Hawk's 3.
Yep.
On GameCube. I played that. That's a great level. Solid level.
Super fun. The game at the show that got the most attention, though, was Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2, Rogue Leader, which I think has been kind of alluded to in past chapters here. It was developed by Factor 5, which is a company known for pushing the limits on the N64 with the first Rogue Squadron game, and then they helped design the sound chip for the GameCube, and they were pushing the limits there. So these Factor 5 was like full of geniuses, I guess. They were responsible for the N64 version of Resident Evil 2, or at least for compressing the video files down. They compressed 2 full CDs of a PlayStation game into a single cartridge for the N64, and they lost very little quality. It's pretty bonkers, if you ask me. They also did the same thing for a game called Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine, which was a 2-disc PC game, but instead of just compressing the assets like they did for Resident Evil and moving the game to N64, calling it a day, they took the whole game and they sort of reimagined it as this like Zelda game featuring Indiana Jones, and it was like really cool. So Nintendo and LucasArts respected them a lot and didn't want to lose them.
I think I've heard of Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine. There's a bunch of Indiana Jones games that have their own separate stories that were like not related to movies at all, that are all really well done. And
wow. Sounds like an episode.
I know. That's what I'm thinking. Because we've talked about doing a LucasArts episode for a while, and I think there's some of those early on in LucasArts history. So that might be in the back burner. Although it's getting to be October, and I'm feeling a little spooky game time soon, I think. We might take a break from the book so I can do some spooky games. That sounds fun. Okay.
Yeah. So I think the most important title, though, at the start of the GameCube's life was, well, and maybe over the entire lifetime of the GameCube, but Super Smash Bros. Melee, which was technically not a launch title. It came out 2 weeks after the GameCube came out, but I think it was the most important. I mean, people are still playing it 20 years later, right? Competitively in tournaments and stuff. It's like very much still alive and kicking, I think, more than any other game from 20 years ago or any other esport from 20 years ago, right?
Melee is great. That's the one that's the one I played where I was genuinely like, oh, they took Smash on 64 and just made everything better. You know, like they knew they had something and it was just perfect. It was such a good game.
Yeah. It was really, really good. Okay, so we'd seen Sony's game lineup, we'd seen Nintendo's, but we didn't talk a lot about Microsoft's launch lineup. And as we know, it's not about hardware. If your system ain't got no games, then it's going to be a flop, right? So Microsoft needed games. And while the launch lineup of the Xbox wasn't particularly impressive, in my opinion, it did have one title that made everything worth it. And that's, Mike.
What?
Halo Combat Evolved. Have you heard of this game, Mike? Have you?
Oh, I've heard. It's from a small indie studio called Bungie, if I recall.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, it was a good game, solid game. I only played it for like 5 minutes?
Yeah.
I can't even say it was straight face.
So we go back to Microsoft's reputation a little bit here. We're going to take it back a little bit. They had this problem, right? They were going through an era that I like to think of as the evil empire era, where some of, like I said, some of our younger listeners may not think of them as this way today. But this is like all of the antitrust stuff was like not awesome for them. So they were, like I said, they were at worst, they were the worst parts of capitalism, all bottled up into one company. At best, they were like the stuffy business company that just made like Office and consumer operating systems and stuff. They weren't exactly hip or with it or whatever the kids were saying at the time. But in order to sell Xboxes to their target demographic, which was gamers and which was not as broad of demographic then as it is now, or not considered as broad, they needed to sort of rehabilitate themselves. They needed to be cool, right? They needed to show that they knew what gamers wanted and that they were hip and with it or whatever. So as the book says, Microsoft can buy a lot of things to help them out in the console wars early 2000s. They can buy advertising. They can have really awesome hardware. But money can't buy a good reputation like what Nintendo and Sony both had. The money was all that Microsoft had, so they went on a spending spree to try to get the games they needed to launch. They tried to buy Rogue Squadron 2 from Factor 5. They offered just a huge amount of money to LucasArts to get Factor 5 to switch from making Rogue Squadron on the GameCube to the Xbox. And there was a lot of pressure to do so. LucasArts wanted them to do this. But Factor 5 was BFFs with Nintendo, and they were like, nah, we're not going to do it. And they convinced LucasArts to not force them to do this, I guess. So they never did. They didn't make it. But they almost did. Yeah, Rogue Squadron was almost not a Nintendo game. It was almost an Xbox game.
Would you say Factor 5 is the opposite of Microsoft?
I would say that, yeah.
They're not the evil empire. They stuck to their guns. That's good.
They sure did. Yeah. Well, and they knew the GameCube inside and out because they kind of helped design a little bit of it. So
yeah, and also Rogue Squadron 2 on GameCube slaps. That's a great game too. I'm going to say that because my buddy, I didn't own a GameCube. My best friend did. And I spent a majority of the early 2000s like in his house playing GameCube with him, going through like all of these games. So yeah, like Rogue Squadron is fantastic. It's a really
super
fun
good game. Yeah. So at this time, Microsoft was looking at what else they could purchase. This is way before E3 2001, by the way. They were looking to get, they weren't like trying to get games like 6 months before launch or whatever, or maybe they were, but this story we're about to tell is not that. So they started looking at this small indie studio called Bungie, which had made a lot of games for the Mac, and they even showed this cool Halo game at Macworld Expo in 1999. Steve Jobs introduced, I think it's Alex Jones that goes up on stage to demonstrate Halo at Macworld in 1999, and that was when it was like a real-time strategy game, and it was very different.
Now, this is Alex Jones at Bungie, not conspiracy theorist Alex Jones, correct?
Yes, and by Alex Jones, I mean Jason Jones.
Okay, good. Because that was the first second I was like, wait a second.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Jason Jones, or it was either that or it was Alex Seropian. That's how I got confused. Alex Seropian was a founder of Bungie, I think.
Okay, good. Because I was like, Alex Jones, wait, what? Is there a weird crossover?
Sorry, no.
That's funny.
So the book goes into details of the origins of Bungie, which I think we've covered. We did Bungie episodes, didn't we? Or we did a Bungie episode?
I actually don't know.
We've done so many episodes now, I can't remember.
I can't remember. I'm pretty sure. I feel like we did, but maybe we didn't. Did I talk about Marathon? No.
Yeah, I think we've talked about Marathon. Well, maybe we should do a Bungie episode. But
yeah, I probably need to do another one because we can't remember if we did it or not.
Yeah. So the book goes into a lot of detail about the origins of Bungie, and I don't think we need to get into it here. It is an interesting story, and I think it's worth buying the book to read about. But Bungie had this Halo game that had some buzz around it. It was starting to look cool. It was a third-person shooter when Microsoft bought it, but it took a certain amount of foresight to be able to see what this game could become. Microsoft ended up purchasing Bungie and making Halo into a first-person shooter launch title for the original Xbox, and it sold like hotcakes and gangbusters, which I think is something we haven't said in a long time on this podcast.
I love it, though. It's our catchphrase.
Yeah. So they made, like, how much of it was luck and how much of it was, like, knowing what they had? That's a great question. We may never know the answer to it, but Halo, like, I think, and I think the book thinks this too, that the Xbox would not have been nearly as successful without Halo. It honestly might not even exist at all today. It might have fizzled out after one console. Microsoft may not have done so well on that console and been like, you know what, let's get out of here and stop this video game thing. That was a nice try. See you later, video game industry. But Halo was such a phenomenon for the original Xbox, especially around launch time. It was the reason to buy an Xbox.
I remember like being in school and friends coming up like, have you played Halo? I'm like, what's this? And they're like, it was like a rumor thing. And then I would go to people's houses for sleepovers. We play like 4-player. And I'm like, this is just, it's got that Bungie thing. And this is going to be me like, hey, surprise, Mike's going to talk about how much he loves Bungie again. Okay. And Destiny's shooting feels good. And that comes from Halo. Like Halo's shooting feels, the gunplay just feels really good and fun. And you don't care. You can shoot aliens all day because it feels so good. And that's what that had, which is something that maybe no other first-person shooter on console had before. Yeah. Because they were all kind of ho-hum. You know, the closest you would get is to something feeling good was Doom. That was on PC, you know? So, yeah, it just felt so good.
Yeah. I think it was the best launch title of that generation, I think.
For sure.
Maybe Melee comes close if you count that as a launch title, or like maybe Tony Hawk 3. Still, Halo was huge for Microsoft, and it changed the course of the company forever.
And it defined a genre, too. Like, it
did.
made console first-person shooters.
Yeah. Before that, console first-person shooter was like GoldenEye, which never even came close. Well, it came to like, it was like third place the year that it came out in terms of like sales. An FPS on console had never been the top-selling game of the year. But Halo did it, and it beat GoldenEye, and it was like I said, GoldenEye was probably the biggest shooter before Halo, at least on console. PC had a lot of shooters, but they didn't sell nearly as many games as console games did. Like PC gaming is pretty big now. Back in those days, it wasn't as big as the consoles were. Like if you were a gamer back then, you pretty much played console games, unless you were like a diehard PC fan. And there were a lot of shooters to play on PC, but they didn't sell the way that games on consoles did.
Do you think it has to do with the fact that now we're in the age of dual analog sticks, and that just made first-person shooters feel better to play?
I think so. And I think that Halo really made that the standard, because dual analog sticks existed on the PlayStation 1, and there were first-person shooters on the PlayStation 1 that did not use that setup. So like Halo, it was like you needed the hardware to be able to do the dual analog stick control scheme, obviously. But Halo showed how to do it, right? And from then on out, if you made a first person shooter that didn't use the same control scheme as Halo, at least in terms of analog sticks, like you goofed. Your first person shooter was bad. Which is so funny because there's a I think it was an Alien versus Predator game that came out on PS2 in like the first year of the PS2. And it did use that. It was before Halo, and it used that control scheme that Halo did. And there's like a famous, this person probably never hears the end of it, but like a reviewer who was like reviewing this game, talking about how good it is or bad it is. I think it was like a pretty mediocre game. But he gets to the controls, and he's like, the control scheme is this weird, like you walk forward and backward with the left stick, and then you walk side to side when you do it. You don't turn, and then you use the other analog stick to look around, and it's just a really weird, jarring control scheme. It doesn't make any sense at all. Which is so funny because now it's the standard. That
it's like,
Halo,
you hate the future? Is that what you do?
Yeah. So yeah, the book goes on and on to talk about how big Halo was for the industry, and I don't disagree with that, but I think we've talked about it a lot in the past on this podcast, and so I don't want to rehash it.
Yeah, total fanboy over here. So
yeah, but I think Halo is one of the most important video games all time, and definitely the most important game for the Xbox ever. Like, I don't think, like, if you have a different opinion, come at me, bro. Like, I will argue with you.
We're going to get an email. But what about Bloodwake? What about Bloodwake?
What about Bloodwake?
I'm going to have t-shirts made that say, what about Bloodwake on them?
So before we go, there was one more platform launching around this time, which was the Game Boy Advance. And that came out in June of 2001, right around the time of this E3. I remember getting my Game Boy Advance on launch day. And I got a copy of Super Mario Advance.
I didn't get mine on launch day, but I got one on a trip because we were going to Alaska, and my mom, like my Game Boy, I think my friend lost it. And and I was like really bummed. And she's like, it was one of the years like, this is your birthday and Christmas in June. Like, it's like, and I'm like, yes, please. And it was so great. Oh my gosh, such a good system.
Yeah. The GBA was like marketed as this sort of like handheld Super Nintendo, which was pretty novel at the time, I think. Taking console quality games with you on the go, that sounds awesome, right? So the GBA was cool. It sold almost as many consoles as the PS2 did in 2001, and the GBA was only available for the second half of the year, so it almost outsold despite being on the market for half as long. It played its own games, but it also played all Game Boy Color and original Game Boy games. It was fully backward compatible, which was pretty incredible for a handheld at the time, and still is, honestly. I think the PS Vita being backward compatible was pretty cool with PSP games, but like the Switch, there's no backward compatibility there unless you count the emulator stuff that's on Nintendo Online.
The Game Boy Advance is the reason I still have my copy of Pokemon Red, because I could play it on Game Boy Advance. Which is like the best. And I don't have my like wide, because there's two models of Game Boy Advance, right? There's the white. Well, I had a white one that was wider, the screens on the side to side. And then there's the SP, which is what I have now that a friend just gave me.
Yeah.
His SP. And that's cool too. But I really miss like the wider controller scheme where the screen was in the middle and the controls were on either side. That was what I originally had, and I missed that. But like, yeah, it's a great system. It's so good, and the backwards compatibility is so great too.
Yeah, there was a third one, the Game Boy Micro, which was not backward compatible, if I recall correctly. It only played Game Boy Advance games. It was very small, but it has that same. It was the same wide control scheme that you liked.
Yeah.
So maybe worth looking at, and it had a backlit screen, so that's a pretty big deal.
I think the SP that I have has a backlit screen. I can turn the button on and off.
Yeah. SPs all have backlit screens. Well, some of them have frontlit screens, and then some of the newer SPs had backlit screens that looked way better.
You can buy like hack parts for even old Game Boys to backlight the screen, which I think is pretty cool.
Yes, you can. Which is important because this is the one thing the book knocks about the Game Boy Advance. It doesn't talk a lot about the Game Boy Advance. Maybe we'll get there later, but it does talk about how the screen wasn't that great. And it was so not great that there were aftermarket kits made available pretty quickly for people to add lighting to the screens. And that's a whole process. One of these days, I'm going to get a Game Boy Advance to do that too.
I love getting the book light thing for it. That's what I had.
Yeah, a little worm light.
Yeah, the little worm light. That's what it was called. Oh my gosh, nostalgia overload. That's perfect.
Yeah, the screen on that Game Boy, on the Game Boy Advance, the original Game Boy Advance, was just not great. It was like not backlit. It was low res. You had to like remember back in the. I mean, you had to do this with older Game Boys too. Remember back in the day of like having to hold your Game Boy at the right angle to catch the light so that you could.
Oh, do I remember? Do I remember trying to play at night and like using street lights as I walk by to see where my screen is?
Yeah, that was like, it's a good thing Pokemon was turn-based because you could pick your move, and then when the street light was gone, you couldn't see anymore, but that was fine. You didn't need to like react to anything, you know? And then when the next street light came, you could pick your next move.
Or I'd ask my mom if I can turn the light in the car on in the middle, and she'd be like, "No, it's dangerous," and I never understood why. And I still don't understand
it's dangerous, or it's illegal. I think my dad would tell me it's illegal.
Yeah, I think that might be a big lie. That might be a big lie of parents. We just stumbled onto something. This is our parents lying to us. I'm gonna do some Googling of traffic laws later tonight to figure this out.
Yeah. I don't know why. I guess because it reflected in the windshield. I don't know.
Maybe
I've never had a problem with that.
I think it's lying parents, and I still have a stigma. Like if I turn it on to find something, I still feel weird. Like it's put a thing in my head from this. So what I'm trying to say is if you're listening to this podcast and you're a parent, don't scar your children with the dome light in your car, okay? Let them use it if they need to see. There's one thing you learn from this podcast.
All right, we're almost done here. Every console did all right in its launch window. Sony had the head start. Microsoft had a Halo. Nintendo had a $100 price difference, so it was a lot cheaper. Made it a no-brainer for some. Also, Nintendo lost less per console as well. They were estimated to only be losing $20 on their $200 GameCube in the beginning. I think they made a profit on it later, but Microsoft was estimated to be losing $100 for every $300 Xbox that they sold. But nothing sold as well as the PS2. Like it was just in another world. Like it just totally crushed everybody. And their head start was it was a huge deciding factor for them. And I don't think the GameCube or the Xbox never caught up to the PS2. Like it continued to just truly crush it. So yeah, that's that's basically like the E3 of 2001. And now we're at the point where all those consoles are out and it's all about them games, which is what we'll cover next week. So I think we'll cover them next week. I didn't look ahead to see what Chapter 6 is about, so I'm assuming, but we'll see.
Yeah, I didn't. So we're going to cover Chapters 6 and 7 next week. So if you're trying to read along with us, that's what you read along with. If you haven't yet, you should buy the book because we're really encouraging people because it was so nice of Steven to come on the podcast and talk about it. Yeah. And it'd be really cool if you bought the book. So
yeah, and there's a lot of stuff we're leaving out here when we talk about it. So
or support your local library and check out the book. That's something
That's
too.
right. You can do that too.
Show people that libraries are cool again. Okay.
Yeah. So what you been playing, Mike?
Oh, well, I've been playing a lot of Destiny this week. I have a lot of quests in the back burner that I've been doing. And then Tyler and I took our friend through his first dungeon experience in Destiny. And it was so fun. And he was really good. We beat it so quick.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. We got pinnacle gear at the end of it.
We did the final boss in like way too many phases, but it still worked out fine. It was like 6 phases to beat it.
I was worried by the end. I was like, oh no, we're going to goof up here and have to start this whole boss fight over again.
I was like, is there an enrage timer on this boss? Because that's what they have in raids. But the dungeons are way more forgiving, and the dungeons are only 3 people, so it's way more fun. And yeah, it was Prophecy is what we played.
Yeah,
but
so much fun.
I do want to play the other ones with him, even though you don't get pinnacle gear, because it's just fun. They're just so fun to play with friends. Like it's like, a good activity to play with people. And I've been playing a little bit of Zelda, but not a lot. That's pretty much it for me, though. I really haven't been playing a lot of games this week. I've been doing a lot of side programming stuff. But what have you been doing?
I've been playing Destiny with you the past couple of days. Only I put in like 10 hours in like 3 days now. So getting caught up there to be able to do. Hopefully we can get enough people together to do a raid. That'd be fun.
That'd be so fun. And again, if you are listening to this podcast and you play on PC, we'd love to have you join us.
Well, you can play on anything now. It's cross-play.
Oh, yeah, crossplay just came out. There's no reason for us not to do a Codex raid night.
Yeah, we could do that.
That would be really fun. Okay, if you are interested in playing Destiny with Tyler and I, you should send us an email at codexhistorypodcast@gmail.com or hit us up on Discord because that would be fun. And it would be really fun to do that. Yeah.
Okay. Also, maybe I talked about this last week, but I finished Final Fantasy X. And maybe I wasn't done with it by the time we recorded the podcast last week.
That's big, though.
I finished Final Fantasy X. I think it's the only Final Fantasy game I've actually played through twice, start to finish, like actually beat twice, because they're so long.
You talked about last week turning on stuff to like move faster, like turning off random encounters and stuff. Did you end up like just sticking to the things you were at with the counters?
I stuck to my guns on that. Definitely did the speed up things because I don't think there's anything.
Yeah,
like I don't think that removes any challenge from the game or like makes it. It just kind of speeds up a part of the game that honestly really shouldn't be there.
Totally.
So I did that and I started 10-2. That one is a little bit harder. I'm trying to get far enough into it to where the combat system really opens up because I think it does have a really cool combat system. The story is not as good as the first one, and so it's kind of hard to get into, but I'm trying, I'm hoping that I can get into it. I want to like it, so I'm not like looking for reasons not to like it,
Yeah, for sure.
So that's about it. Played a little bit more Dead Cells, just a little bit of Dead Cells though, not too much.
I've kind of fallen off the Hades train. It's because I have these other games. I really want to beat Zelda. I'm like over halfway through it, and I just need to buckle down and play it a couple nights, I think, to beat it because it's so fun.
Yeah.
But you got the new PC thing, right? The handheld.
Oh yeah, I got an Neo handheld computer I just came in today, so I've really only had a little bit of time to mess around with it, but I booted it up and got it all set up and started downloading a bunch of games to it. And it is larger than a Switch because it has a 7-inch screen, but it looks very much like a Switch in that sort of same form factor. It's like probably twice as thick as a Switch, but the controls feel really good on it. It has analog triggers. This newer model has analog triggers, and so I fired up Destiny on it, and it comfortably plays at low settings at 30 frames per second. I think you can get above 30 if you unlock the frame rate, but it's weird if it's not a consistent frame rate. So it's not like going to be my primary place for playing Destiny, but if you go on a trip or something, you want to be able to do your bounties or whatever, it's certainly playable. It's like playing on an original Xbox One or something, although the loading screens are very fast because it has an SSD.
I am personally very excited to see if we are witnessing history with the Steam Deck. If this is going to be like a thing.
This is like a proto Steam Deck, this device, and it runs on a very similar, not quite as new. What the Steam Deck is running on, the AMD hardware is like a little bit newer version of what the Neo has. And so far, I really like it. I mean, it's just a PC, so you can install any PC game on it. I played a little bit of Grand Theft Auto 5 today on it, ran pretty well. You pretty much have to turn everything down to low settings, but the screen is beautiful, and it makes for a really, really good sort of secondary place to play games. And I'm really happy that I prefer to buy games on PC and have for like ever, because now I have all these old games that I've bought on PC and I can just play them portably now, especially older ones that don't require as much hardware.
That's so awesome.
Yeah, it's very cool. So far, so good.
Well, we have one email to read. Do you want me to read it?
Yeah.
This is from John from the Philippines. Hi, guys. It's been a while. I stopped listening for a while due to COVID. I used to use my time on the road to listen to you guys, but got back on it again recently when I started traveling again. I missed you guys, and I'm glad you're still going. Oh, thanks, John. During the COVID, I started getting some collector's editions of games that I like, mainly due to my girlfriend pushing me to collect them by being an amazing bargain hunter. She has a huge collection of video games herself, with a focus on the JRPG Tales series. So far, I have around 4 new ones. Just small ones, though, as I got them for a really cheap price by buying them online from Japan. I'm really excited, though, as I have the collector's edition of both Resident Evil remakes coming in, and I got them at roughly $80 without the games. I plan to just buy them on Steam. With that said, I just wanted to ask if you guys collect collector's editions of games, which one in your collection is your favorite? If you don't, is there a collector's edition that you would want to add to your collection one day? Thank you so much for continuing the podcast. I really enjoyed your interview with Stephen L. Kent, and I'm glad that you guys were able to chat with him, as I know that's one of your dreams. Stay safe and keep gaming. P.S. I think the last time I sent you guys an email, I was still playing Animal Crossing on the 3DS. This time, I'm playing Animal Crossing on the Switch.
Nice.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Thanks for saying that. That was really exciting to get Stephen on the show. I don't think
collector's
I own
editions.
Collector's editions, except for like accidental things where I bought Call of Duty World War II and it just happened to be an extra copy of the first day edition, so I got like dog tags with it. But there are like crazy collector's editions that I've always wanted, and then I've always talked myself out of it because they are so expensive. Like there's some cool Destiny ones where you get like models of the guns and stuff, and I'm like, that would be so cool to have on my desk, but I'm just like, $300 like or something, I just can't justify doing it. What about you, Tyler? Do you have one?
I'm not big on collector's editions of games because I generally don't like the like knickknacks that they give you. Like I would just have too many of them, and there's no space for all that stuff. I have enough just trash that I don't need. But what I do really like are steel books. If there's like a steelbook version of a game that I really enjoy, I will usually pay the extra $10 or $20 to get that version. So I have like steelbooks of Persona 5, both the original and Royal Edition of Persona 5. I have the steelbook of the Final Fantasy 12 remake on PS4. And I'm trying to think if I have any other steelbooks. World of Final Fantasy, I got like the collector's edition because it comes in. It's not a steelbook, but it's like kind of a cooler case. But
that's
yeah,
awesome though.
I do remember wanting to get the big like legendary edition of Halo 3 because it came with that cool like Master Chief helmet thing.
Yeah.
I never did get it. I remember at one point seeing it on sale for cheaper than the boxed copy of it at like a Best Buy or something because they just couldn't get rid of them. They had made so many of them. I didn't get it then, but I sort of regret that. That is one I would have liked. That one and the Pip-Boy one that you could get for with Fallout 3 where it would give you an actual Pip-Boy. That was cool.
Who doesn't want a Pip-Boy? I was also just looking to you about not only just collector's editions, but collector's edition consoles because I'm thinking I'm going to wait for the next gen I always want to wait. You know, I bought my Xbox One first gen like right when it came out, and it's a miracle it's lasted this long. So I'm going to wait until the next new iteration of consoles, like in this generation, but like a newer version,
like,
you know,
like the PS5 Pro.
Yeah, something like that. But I kind of want to get like a Starfield edition or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which is like, because that game looks really cool to me, and I'm like, I'm super excited, and I trust that I'm not going to get a collector's edition of a console and it's a bad game. That would be such a weird moment if you got like a console that was a bad game. Like all the Cyberpunk people that bought Cyberpunk consoles, like,
oh no,
yeesh. Yeah, you know,
Yikes.
like not that the game is bad. The game is good. It just had technical problems at launch that kind of, you know.
Yeah, that's true.
So, but yeah, that's a great question. I do think I get more though if I found bargains. That's a good idea to bargain out.
Sometimes you can find those bargains. I did get the collector's edition, or maybe I just got it as a pre-order bonus, but the original Mirror's Edge game I was so excited for that I think maybe it was just a pre-order bonus. Maybe this doesn't count, but I pre-ordered it at a GameStop, and they gave me it came with like a bag, like the bag that she uses in the game.
Oh, that's cool.
And I used that as a bag for a little while. It was kind of not great construction.
Did you parkour while you did it?
Yeah, I did a lot of parkouring at that time. And
I think Tyler,
no, I did not.
I think parkour.
Yeah, definitely. So that was pretty cool. I still have that bag, and I was not disappointed by the game. Love the original Mirror's Edge. Catalyst was a little bit, I don't know, I couldn't get into it, but I really loved the original Mirror's Edge.
I watched the original. I never got to really play it more than like a level at a friend's house. You know, he let me play like the first level, but I never beat it. But it was a fun game. It just had that flow, that cool flow to it. It really hit the parkour like nature of it, which was great. So
it's on Game Pass, I want to say, because it's part of like EA's thing. So you could probably play it on PC if you wanted to. It's worth
I should just pick it up. There's so many games to play though. I'm having trouble beating some, you know. But yeah. Thank you for the email, John. It was a great email, great question. If you want to send us an email, you can do that at codexhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can join our Discord by sending us an email, or you can go to my Twitter page at mecoletta, MECOLETTA, clicking on the pinned tweet at the top of the page. That's an invite that never expires. And also, Tyler's on Twitter too, SneakerElf, ELPH, if you want to tweet him about Mirror's Edge.
Yeah, send me your Mirror's Edge tweets.
Yeah. With that, that's the episode. So we'll start doing chapters 6 and 7 next week, and then we'll start planning out our spooky Halloween episodes. Ooh. I love it. I kind of want to do all October, do like spooky stuff.
All right.
That sounds fun to me. And I want to talk about Left 4 Dead specifically because you and I both love that game, and so we haven't talked about it yet.
So much Left 4 Dead.
So good. Anyway, but that's it for the day. Do you want to say bye to everybody, Tyler?
Goodbye, everybody.